and welcome to another episode of Code and Pixels. My name is Kelly, and I'm once again joined by my amazing co-host, Adekunle. Today, we'll be chatting with Scott Jehl about web performance.
Thanks, Kelly. Scott is a web designer and developer consultant. Hey, Scott. Thanks
Hey,
for being on the show.
yeah, thanks for having me. Things are going well. Thanks. You've reached me in the Catskills today. I'm visiting some friends and doing a little snowboarding this week.
Oh, I love that. I that's on my bucket list for one of the things I want to do. So super
Nice,
jealous.
nice. There's a little
Um,
snow left.
cool. So first question is, can you describe your career path from your first job to where you're at right now?
Yeah, thanks. So my background, I guess formally, is in design, print design. Actually, I majored in that in college. I went to Flagler College in St. Augustine, Florida. And on the web side, I knew that I wanted to go in that direction of interaction design. But most of it was self-taught, which was really common in those days anyway. Programs at university came along later. I learned by reading books by Eric Meyer and Jeffrey Zeldman and Molly Holschlag, and um, pretty quickly got some freelance gigs. And one of those that I got early on as a student still in college was pretty formative, I think, for the direction that I would go from there. The client was the Florida School for the Deaf and the Blind. And it really changed my whole outlook on what it meant to design and build on the web and design for different um, ways of using the web that I frankly wasn't even aware of going into that. I was a little unprepared actually, and really lucky to get that client at all. But needless to say, the accessibility requirements even then were really required a lot of studying and learning things that I had never encountered before. And it just really made me interested in going in that direction further. So I think like prior to that, I was more inspired by maybe like Flash and motion graphics to get me into the web. And from there, I was much more interested in designing accessibly and with performance, I think, which sort of came along later. From there, I moved to Boston and was able to get a job with the Filament Group, a Boston-based design agency, small agency. I ended up working there for 15 years. It was just a great variety of work. We had some amazing clients, despite being a pretty small studio. Got to build the front end for the Lego store, worked with Starbucks, Vineyard Vines, and one of our biggest her best known clients was the Boston Globe. And that was the first large scale implementation of responsive design, or one of at the time. And, but yeah, just from there, we had a pretty nice balance of open source work and writing and speaking at conferences and things like that. I was on the jQuery team for a number of years, right from the first few months when John started it. A lot of great experiences in framework design and things came out of that. And then briefly on the writing side, I've written a couple of books. In 2010, I did designing with progressive enhancement. 2014 was a responsive design, just taking the concepts of responsive design further to talk about performance and accessibility a little bit more. And I released a course on web performance a few years ago called Lightning Fast Web Performance. And around that time, I moved on from Filament Group and started working for Catchpoint, which makes web page test. Got to do some really fun product work for them. And now I'm independent. So that's where I'm at these days. Lately, I've been consulting with Begin.com, who makes the enhanced frameworks, a lot of web components work. And it's been really fun.
Wow, a lot of big names and quite the departure from print, I would say.
I kind of miss it now. I don't know. It'd be nice to go back.
So, Scott, as an independent consultant, I'm just curious, what does your day-to-day look like? Or is there even a day-to-day, or is every day different?
Yeah. Currently it's pretty flexible. I live in Brooklyn and been there for almost 4 years now. So really like New York City. It's been a nice change from Florida before that and Boston before that. As a consultant, I think my days they're not very consistent. So I like to get some consistent aspects. My kids go to school in the neighborhood. I like to walk them back and forth. I like to get out and skateboard at lunch. But some work happens too. um, yeah, I've been working mostly out of my home or at local cafes and things like that, and consulting with Begin as of late. And right now, I'm starting to work on a new course on web components, so that's my new focus. Producing that this spring.
I love it. I love the idea of skateboarding in the streets of New York. I feel like that'll be super fun to do. Um,
Yeah, there's a bunch of good parks nearby. Yeah, it's nice.
um, to talk about web performance, how do you define web performance, and why is it so important for websites and applications to think about web performance while they're building?
It's a good question. So I guess I think it was probably around like 2014 or so, our field started to talk about performance a little differently, and measure it a little differently and speak in terms of perceived performance and moments that are perceivable to the end user, as opposed to like measurements that we used prior to that, which were largely concerned with how many kilobytes were getting shipped over the wire, but not necessarily. If we didn't have anywhere near the tooling that we have today to be able to measure how those numbers really translate to what someone actually receives on their end on their device. Um, to me, that idea of perceived performance, um, I think we have metrics that align well to those moments that represent how someone first receives the code of a website and then engages with it over time. And I think of those two sort of groups of performance metrics distinctly, where delivery has its own series of metrics that are additive. Um, and post delivery, we have some new metrics that I'll probably get to later that deal more with like the responsiveness, how it feels as you work through a session with a website. Um, and I think overall, all of that sort of factors into, for me, this idea of a broader idea of accessibility and access, not like proper accessibility. Certainly that's like its own focus in itself. But I think that performance is the first concern, being able to access anything on the web. So it's super critical. And I like to think holistically, like the first step and something that really everyone on the team has an opportunity to improve or degrade. So it should be important to everyone and throughout a project.
I love that you touch on responsiveness and just how does it feel, like that qualitative experience when someone's on the web, on a native platform. And so you mentioned metrics and we talk about speed, accessibility. So for you personally, what are your top metrics?
Yeah. So yeah, I guess I mentioned those, this sort of group of delivery metrics. I like to look at those first. The ones that are additive come to mind for me first. So like time to first byte is the classic sort of server exchange to client metric that we would look at, which basically tells you how soon some degree of code arrives in the browser that it can start to make sense of. Typically, that's the first HTML bytes, right? Um, and I think that that metric is really important because it sets the baseline for all of the numbers, or many of the numbers at least, that follow, whether it's the first time that pixels paint on a white screen, or the first moment that more meaningful pixels like text and images paint, or a metric like the largest contentful paint, which is like a subset of those pixels and sometimes text metrics, where you're measuring just one of them that happens to be most noticeable in the viewport. And all of those sort of like, at least those that I mentioned, are very additive. So I like to look at those first. And even if some numbers are particularly quick, I like to look at the gaps between them. Because if there's a long gap between say, time to first byte and the first paint, then we can start to think about bottlenecks that would contribute to the length of time. And maybe we're loading style sheets or scripts in a way that prevents pixels from painting to the screen as soon as they something like that might happen in that gap. Or if we're seeing pixels paint, but we're not seeing text on the screen, maybe we need to look at that gap and investigate how our fonts are loading to see if maybe there's a delay there where the browser's waiting too long for a custom. So things like that, I think I like to look at those gaps. So those are like the delivery additive metrics. And there's a couple other metrics that deal with delivery that are not quite so literally part of that additive stack. CLS is one of those that come to mind. Cumulative layout shift. I like to say of all the metrics, that one's hardest to say. It's just trips me up. But that one deals with how much the content is moving and jostling as it settles into place. And that's not necessarily an additive thing like the other ones, but it's certainly something that if you measure and see that it's problematic, that it's maybe on the tools that you use to read these metrics, it says that you need to work on CLS, then you can know to jump into like maybe my images need more dimensions or aspect ratios specified, something like that to try to cement the layout right when it's delivered the first time. So those are delivery metrics. And then I tend to look at those first just because I think of performance as delivery and post-delivery. And then post-delivery, we have other metrics. Like traditionally, if there is such a term in performance, we had some metrics like time to interactive or first input delay. And those have gone out of favor in recent, even like weeks, in favor of new metrics like INP, interaction to next paint, which provide us with a really good idea of how quickly a UI can respond to user interaction, like keyboard clicking. That one is very much concerned with how much JavaScript is churning after an interaction takes place, and it measures throughout a whole session of using a website and gives us the longest latency of all the interactions as a worst case. I think that one's really good. It just became a core web vital, which is Google's term for the most important metrics to be looking at, like a week ago, I think. And I think it's going to require a lot of companies to refocus how they're looking at performance, because suddenly those numbers at least may not be as good as they've been used to seeing.
Yeah, thanks for walking us through that. Yeah, for me, like performance is a thing that I feel like I don't know much about, but I know it's important. So it's always great to hear your thoughts about like key metrics and whatnot. Um, I got an interesting question. So let's say someone hires you, Scott, they have like a snowboarding application. It's super slow, clunky, and they're like, all right, we want to hire Scott to kind of fix it. What is your process of improving the performance? And I'm just wondering the steps and how you will work with organization to figure out the best, like what's next and how to improve it.
Yeah, good question. It sounds really practical. We're fortunate to have really good tools to test performance. And I think the first two that I tend to reach for are Page Speed Insights, which is Google tool that runs Lighthouse, and some other tools that I can get into. And Web Page Test is another one, which I've been a fan of for over a decade. I got the chance to work for them, but I am a big fan nonetheless. So between those two tools, I think you can get a really good idea of, you go to these tools in the browser, you can just type in the URL of the website that you're trying to test, and it will pretty quickly turn around first some pretty high level diagnostic information about how well the page performed, And then you can dig in to detail into any bottlenecks that it suggests are present. Um, I would say that between the two, web page tests is going to let you dig a lot deeper into those bottlenecks and figure out through, you can look at a waterfall of the requests that happen in a page and look at it compared to a timeline of the actual keyframes of the page loading and be able to line those up and see, okay, it looks like there's a delivery bottleneck right here. Things are stalled out for a long time. I can look down in the waterfall at that moment and see if I can try to correlate, at least at that point, what might be causing that bottleneck before I dig in further. Um, and yeah, when you say something feels slow, I would say, okay, is it slow on delivery? Is it a long delay between when you click a link and actually see something on your screen? Or is it a long delay between you seeing something and being able to actually use it? Because that can be a sign that the website is over reliant on JavaScript just churning on the front end and clogging up the main thread. Or is it a delay in just like responsiveness when you're trying to use it after it delivers? And sometimes a site can deliver really quickly and then feel slow after delivery, right? Um, so depending on where the slowness is happening, or maybe it's all of those, and you've got a lot of work on your hands, but you can figure out where to prioritize your work first, depending where the problems are. Um, I think like for delivery metrics, if it's a slow delivery, I would look right away at how the JavaScript and the CSS is being delivered to the browser. Are we delivering more code than we need to in it's called critical path before the primary content of the page? Can we load any of that in a lower priority to get it out of the way? Let the page show sooner. And a lot of that initial step lately comes down to where is the HTML being generated? Is the server sending HTML, or is the server sending a lot of JSON and JavaScript to generate the HTML after it arrives in the browser? If it's the latter, then that can be pretty problematic depending on the amount of HTML that you're generating. Browsers really aren't built to receive a website that way. They really are built to receive HTML and scan it really early and figure out all the resources in it and compile the page that way. So I would say it's so many different solutions depending on what sort of bottlenecks you're seeing. But if it's that latter situation where there's no HTML up front and it's being generated and there's a little spinner, I would say first priority is to start moving as much work as you can to the server, and HTML should start there, ideally, for that to be a lot faster. Yeah.
Wow, there's a lot of detective work that goes into figuring out why is
Yeah.
my website slow?
Yeah. I think the tools we have now are really good at explaining the bottlenecks in a way that even non-developers can get a good idea of at least what sort of problem they're dealing with and be able to contact the right people at their organization to work on it. So I think the terminology has gone from like super technical 10 years ago to trying to find shared vocabulary that people can use across a whole team. So I think it's getting better in that way. Even if you look at the results of these tools, I know at Web Page Test, a big focus of the work I was doing was not to just present a score, but to actually describe what's happening, whether it's good or bad, in a way that maybe a site owner who doesn't touch code at all could understand, okay, our initial delivery is too slow. I need to contact the person who works on that part. I think the tools are getting better in that regard.
It's great to hear for all of us because I love things are easy to understand, explain to me like I'm 5, things that aren't
Me too.
necessarily too technical. I love things that doesn't matter what level you are, you can understand what the problem is and how we can fix it. I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about more of the atomic part of these experiences, specifically around design systems. And I would love to know what are some ways that design system teams could incorporate performance or something that you wish design system teams knew to help teams have better performant apps and sites?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I think that design systems teams really set the pace for how a site's going to be compiled into an overall UI and then delivered to the browser. So a lot of really important decisions happen on that team that can impact performance. I think for delivery metrics, it's often not at the component level so much as like at an overall how things are packaged together and then sent at that very last step. So it's important to look at it comes together. Is the HTML dependent on JavaScript to generate each component in the page? If so, then that's going to have a large impact on when all of the React components are brought into the same UI. Each of them is being generated once they arrive at the browser. I think design system teams can see the eventual impact of that architecture early on. And I don't know, I think it's important to start, you don't want to like prematurely think about performance too much when you're starting to build an application for the first time, but you also don't want to leave it until later. And I think design systems teams can make a lot of decisions like, was the CSS included in the page? Is it being included for components that are not on the page? Are we shipping wasteful in that way? Is it server generated? Is it client generated? Are we loading JavaScript files on the client side in a way that deferred? Or are we waiting for not only the request to the script to go out while we block the UI, but also turning into the interactivity that we end up using? All of that is, I think it comes from design system teams that are figuring out how those components are compiled into the page. And yeah, they should think a lot about performance, I think, especially delivery performance. And then I think like for metrics like IMP, it comes down to like if you're on a design systems team that's doing a lot of React work, for example, or just something with a lot of high degree of reactivity, then you're probably doing a lot more work with JavaScript on the client after each interaction in the page to make the UI respond and update. And then performance is massively the design systems team's concern. It varies by code base. Yes, it was a long-winded answer, but
No, I agree. It's funny. I just was first time working on a performance project for the design system I was working on, and it was eye opening because I was like, oh, it works well until you actually go through like the whole metrics and seeing like how heavy your component libraries actually is. Um, and this actually goes to like my next question where um, CSS is probably one of the more heaviest assets when you think about performance overall. And I'm wondering like, can you elaborate on like the reason behind this, but also are there other are there ways we can write CSS that makes it more performant? Because there's a lot of cases where we have like inline CSS, we have utility classes, we have CSS and JS. I'm just wondering, like, what is the best way to make CSS more efficient overall?
yeah, um, it's a lot of questions actually in there. um, so yeah, I would say so. Foremost, like if you're seeing bottlenecks in delivery metrics, I would look to JavaScript first before I would look to CSS, because overwhelmingly, as the trends have gone in the last 10 years in our field, we've become more JavaScript dependent, right? On delivery, on generating content. And CSS can absolutely cause performance bottlenecks, but it's often not the first thing to look to as like the biggest contributor to performance problems. But if you have determined that your CSS is causing bottlenecks, I would say it commonly does that in a couple of ways. I think the most common way is in how CSS is delivered, right? So like if you use just the most standard classic way to load a style sheet, a link element with a rel attribute of style sheet to an external file, the browser's default behavior is to stop what it's doing as far as rendering is concerned and go back to the server, get that file, and once it arrives, it can parse it and then proceed further with rendering. That can be an anti-pattern, right? And you can imagine that if there's a lot of CSS that's not necessary for maybe the initial paint of the screen that you're trying to produce, or just maybe even for the overall page, there's styles in that style sheet that are not going to apply to anywhere on that page, then you might consider that to be wasteful code delivery. And it depends. Like sometimes you might have strategies where you're intentionally loading some CSS that you don't need right away because you're caching it and then it's there for good throughout the rest of the session. And within reason, that's a good strategy too. But I think if you can notice that going back to the server to get CSS is a noticeable bottleneck on delivery, there are great techniques that you can use to get that out of the way. I guess the simplest would be to figure out if there's any CSS that doesn't need to be in there, so you can try to make it lighter. But also classically inlining CSS right in the HTML in a style element is a way to render the page right when it's delivered, as opposed to going back to the server for more. And all those round trips contribute to delays, right? The latency of the network matters, especially in those steps. Page is first delivered. You don't want to be making a lot of render blocking trips back to the server for anything. So some of our assets, like we talk about JavaScript being a particular problem for performance, but typically when we load JavaScript, we can do so in a way that doesn't block the UI, right? Like through either deferring it or making it asynchronous. CSS is typically not loaded in that way. So you're either requesting a style sheet that's blocking, or you're inlining it, or you're maybe looking at ways to defer it by putting it in at the bottom of the page or something like that. But those have penalties too, because you want the page to render without the styles that you need. So I would say that's the most common way that I see CSS contributing to performance bottlenecks. That's not to say it's the only way. I think selector speed comes up more often than it should as a performance concern. It's not going to be one of the heavy hitters that blocks the user experience heavily. But sure, some selectors are faster than others. So it's something to keep in mind, at least, if you can keep your specificity low. And things like utility CSS that you talked about are good examples of how some developers have taken that advice and addressed CSS with the lowest specificity single class selectors that they can. And I think there's a number of ways to do that. Like people get into pretty strong opinions about utility CSS versus writing CSS outright. I happen to love writing CSS, and I love the expressive nature of it through writing selectors and media queries and container queries and all these things that are not impossible utility CSS, but certainly like you have to abstract it somehow, right? And I think it depends a lot on the scale of the team, which approach you're going to want to take. I certainly have met lots of developers who work on large organizations who like, we have no choice but to use utility CSS because it's too easy to cause another part of the site to regress when I'm editing this file. And that's genuinely, it's a hard concern, a hard thing to get right. Yeah, but I would say delivery is where CSS gets in the way most with performance. But you can certainly make it faster or slower by loading less, or even optimizing it if you can with selectors.
I love it. I always say that you always should pick the right tool for the right problem. So all these solutions have a time and a place, and I think that's the beauty about the web is like everyone has opinions, but I think it's always a case where you use the right tool for the situation you're in.
Yeah. I don't
Um,
know if like embedding is maybe the more common term for what I was talking about than inlining, but yeah. And either way, I've heard it said both ways.
um, so we have like a fun question, but like, what is? I know you're into web performance, but what's your biggest hot take about performance?
Yeah. I don't tend to be one of the people that like throws a big hot take out on Twitter and um but yeah, I'll play along. So I think that in the last 10 years or so, our field has went in a direction of prioritizing developer experience over user experience in a way that has degraded the way websites work for a lot of people on actual devices. And I think there's a big disconnect there often between the devices that we use both on our phones and to develop websites day to day as web developers. A disconnect between that and what a lot of the world is actually using in their homes and the connection speeds that they have, and just what the average typically low end Android device looks like these days and how quickly it can and interact with the sites that we're building. So I would say that trend is reversing, it seems, at least. Like the discussions that I see are taking a harder look at JavaScript centric, client heavy HTML generation kind of patterns and saying, I don't think this was really working in the ways that we had hoped, even if it was working well for large teams to work together. So, yeah, that's my hot take. I try not to be measured.
No, I think you have a point because I feel like again when we build products, it's like to benefit the user, and I think there's definitely been a shift where it's like everything's JavaScript. We're going to do all the stuff that's better for developers, but sometimes that has a negative impact to the user experience. So I think always the case where it's like UX first and then DX next. And um, but I think sometimes it's hard because people want to use like the latest greatest tools and whatnot.
Yeah, ideally, you want both. And yeah, I think as long as the leaders on teams are keeping that in mind, right, then they should be able to find some way to meet in the middle so that what they're delivering ultimately is working really well for people. I guess the other sort of related hot take I have is that I've been working with web components quite a lot in the last couple of years. And I feel like they're finally coming into a moment where it's going to be a hard transition, but we now have a standard component model. And I think we should be questioning why we're using proprietary ones when we have a standard one. So moving away from the React and other framework kind of mindset is not going to be an easy one especially for a lot of big teams. But there are great advantages to being able to defer to native browser handling of like a component lifecycle and not reproducing that in a way that's not going to be built into the browser ever, right? Um, I think more and more we need to be thinking in that direction, even if it's not perfect, right? Like we see a lot of comparisons between web components seem great, but they can't do this specific thing. And it's like, you're right. Like they can't, but um, at a certain point, we need to start working with them and what they can do and working around the compromises and just getting the benefits of that, shipping less code, really.
Yeah, I totally agree. I feel that's the purpose of these frameworks is like pushes the boundaries where at the 5 years, 10 years later, those like features are going to be supported by the native HTML and all that stuff.
Totally.
I'm looking for a feature for that because I'm burnt out with React. It might take time. Um,
It's like, it's an ongoing repeating process. Like we saw this with Flash, which was dramatically better than CSS animation for a really long time. And ultimately, CSS benefited from so many things that came from those, at least like visual motion design patterns that were developed in Flash and made common. Same thing with, jQuery. I was on the jQuery team forever, and like the entire goal of that framework was to make itself redundant with web standards. And I think it succeeded. There's so many native JavaScript methods now that, roughly copied what people loved about the jQuery API. And I take no credit for that. I was not part of the core team designing the API, but it was wonderful in a lot of ways. It was also a hindrance. Like after a while, it was like, we don't need jQuery anymore to do these things because the browser can do them. And I think we're at or we're near that step with components now. And it's always a hard transition, right? But it repeats.
Love it. I'm super excited for it. Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you, Scott, for joining us
Yeah.
for today's
Thanks so much for having me.
conversation.
This is fun.
No problem. We also want to thank our listeners for tuning into this episode. For more content, feel free to visit our websites for all of our previous episodes, subscribe to our newsletter, also connect with us with social media at codeandpixels.fm. Wishing you all a good and fantastic day. See ya.
All right. Thanks.